So, welcome to today's crash course on qualitative coding for research. Now, the goal really is threefold. We're going to talk about some strategies for qualitative coding for sure, and we're going to talk about the differences, under which circumstances and context do we apply which strategy. But before that, we're going to talk a bit about the some concepts that we need when talking about coding, talking about analysis, talking about interpretation. And it's really the first step is to develop that language, a common language to talk about some of these higher order concepts. So the second goal is to really differentiate between ideas, description, and interpretation. And we will spend a bit of time on differentiating between these. I will give you the definitions for both of them, provide you with questions to help you to determine what's the line between a description and an interpretation. And why this is important is because when you analyze participants' experiences, when you think about what they actually mean, it becomes really hard to differentiate between what is a description and what is an interpretation. And an emphasis on one or the other helps you to narrow down what your analytical approach is. Generally, studies tend to be on a more descriptive nature. Epidemiological studies that are published, quantitative studies that are published tend to be more descriptive in nature, primarily because they look at a specific data set, a specific conclusion, and they make that conclusion as it is. Whereas on the other hand, an interpretation is more characteristic of philosophical studies, of anthropological studies, of higher order abstract ideas that go well beyond what the specific data set is saying to the researchers. And that's just a little bit of difference, but and then what we'll do is we'll go through one example together on how sort of coding proceeds, and that will help you to visualize and implement some of the strategies we talk about to do qualitative coding. Okay, so now before we get started on talking about description and interpretation, let's imagine that you see this in front of you. How would you describe? Now, let me talk about what sort of methodologists have defined description and interpretation, and then we'll revisit this image. It's a very easy difference to understand. Where description, on one hand, is the dictionary definition. It's something that is shared amongst almost everyone, you would say. Interpretation, on the other hand, is the meaning of it, the implied meaning, the hidden meaning that's there. And it's everything that goes beyond the literal meaning or beyond the literal observation. So, for example, a color. I see a silver and green bottle in front of me. Likely, someone who's sitting beside me will also see a green and silver bottle. And that would classify as description. Though, of course, there's differences. Someone may be colorblind and may not see green. That difference aside, generally, a description is where the majority of people will agree upon what is being observed. One other way to describe interpretation is that when you have a particular find or a particular piece of information and you want to communicate it to different audiences. So, for example, the findings of a research study, you want to communicate it to patients, to clinicians, and to policymakers. You're not necessarily going to communicate in the same way using the same script and language to these three different audiences. So you have to tailor your conversation and your language to that specific audience. And that process of tailoring is an interpretive process because you make the judgment of what's relevant and what's effective in terms of your word choice. That's part of interpretation. And then finally, one more thing about interpretation is that if you think about it, interpretation is dependent upon description. You have to describe something first to interpret it, right? But you don't necessarily have to interpret every single thing. You can leave it at description. That's what a lot of academic research studies do. But to go to the interpretive dimensions of any particular phenomenon, you have to describe it first. You have to understand what's going on before you go beyond. So these are just some questions to help you differentiate between description and interpretation. And they're just general guides of when you're thinking about a particular object or idea, these are indicators, general indicators, I would say, of what's a description and interpretation. And again, I would emphasize that there's a very blurry line between description and interpretation at many points during analysis. Sometimes we cannot tell because it's just so muddled together that we cannot separate our interpretations from what's actually happening in the data. So in description on the one hand, and I won't go through all of this, you can always look at this afterwards. Description on the one hand is, things like what is this? What are its features? Who is it? Where did it come from? And where is it situated? So very and characteristics of a particular idea or object. Interpretation, on the other hand, on the right side is, things like what does this mean? What does it say? Who knows it and how do they know it? How do I know it? And can it mean various things, various different things? When talking about the definition, there is a very distinct difference between description and interpretation, but once you start analyzing, you will see that that difference, that distinction, does not truly exist, and it becomes very difficult to navigate through whether what you see is a description or an interpretation of your own. Coming back to this, now reflecting about how you answered my questions earlier, how would you describe it now that you know the difference between description and interpretation? Now, thinking about description versus interpretation, it may not be a glass bottle because technically it's not in front of you. You don't feel it. I may say, it's a plastic bottle, just looks like glass, for example. But since there's no way to verify between us, it's not a shared understanding, right? It's a different understanding, and therefore we go into a little bit of interpretation based on our stereotypes of what glass bottles look like. This looks like a glass bottle, and therefore it should be a glass bottle. But since you don't have any way to verify that, it becomes an interpretation, especially because someone else might say it's a plastic bottle or whatever. There's a little bit of variation in what you see. And the same thing goes that when you said, I am presuming this is milk, that's when you know that you're going into interpretation. You're presuming something, you're assuming something, and that's based on a set of observations. Those observations are assumption is interpreted, right? If that makes sense. This is white, those might be description. But based on those two characteristics, you said it was milk, that's an interpretation because there's so many other white liquids that exist. So is this sort of making sense of what the difference is between description and interpretation? Okay. So now that being said, let's talk about coding. Now, on the slide are two key definitions that I've taken from methodological texts. Now, there are several definitions of qualitative coding, but I found that these are probably the easiest to understand. Is Sharma, constructive grounded theory, and she says that coding is the process of naming segments of data with a label that simultaneously categorizes, summarizes, and accounts for each piece of data. Whereas on the other hand, Johnny Saldana, the second bullet point, he quotes from his book, which is sort of like a manual for qualitative research, and it is, I would say, one of the go-to books when you want to analyze qualitative data. He says that he says a code is a word or short phrase that symbolically assign a summative, salient, essence capturing, and evocative attribute for a portion of language or visual data. And essentially, if you want to take these two definitions, the key point here is that it is a label. You see something, and a code is a label that you attribute to that something. Coding is the process of coming up with that label based on what you see. A code describes what you see in that data. Think of a paraphrase. Read an article, we paraphrase. And the paraphrase is used as a way to summarize what we see. And we use possibly similar words as what we see in the data, but possibly different words, our own words that we are more comfortable in using that make more sense to us. Those words, those decisions that we make, all of that encompass coding. Now, important point here is that coding is not analysis. And what I mean by that is coding is a mechanism to keep track of and manage analysis. And think of it as the metaphor of, physically writing. Whereas to know how to physically you can write well, you can write eloquent. Kids can write, but they cannot write long novels that are beautifully written, that are grammatically correct, and all these kinds of things. So coding is the physical act of writing, whereas analysis is going beyond that. It is, well, similarly, coding allows you to look at that data in different ways, but the analysis really happens in your head. It is the cognitive strategies you use to compare and contrast ideas between participants, between articles, if we're for our context when we're looking at different articles, between participant quotes within the same article, between participant quotes between different articles, between ideas that are represented in articles. All of that is within our mind, and that is the analytical process. Coding allows us to get to that stage. So now I'm just going to sort of depict what coding generally feels, and I find that talking about this helps to establish expectations. It helps to clear up what is it going to feel like during the process and at the end of the process. And this experience tends to be almost always characteristic of an individual who engages in qualitative coding for the first time. And this is taken from my master supervisor, who basically on the left side, this is you, and this is your capacity to handle information. This is the volume of data that's increasing, and throughout the increase of this data, you can handle it, you can manage it, it's okay, you're comfortable. But at some point, it goes beyond your capacity, and that is basically what she calls a period of despair, where you question yourself, your methods, your analysis, life, etc. Again, that's but even though this seems a little bit daunting, always keep in mind that if it peaks and it goes back into your felt capacity, and the period of despair decreases. Another way of saying this is the following tweet about the creative process. And very much qualitative coding is a very creative process. So I'll give you a moment to read this, and then we'll move on to the stages of coding. Reiterating the point that, at some points throughout the process, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to feel uncertain about a lot of things. And I have seen this many, many times. I've seen it in Mubin, for example, the first time he did the qualitative coding for our vaccine patients manuscript. I've seen it in myself the very first time I did. And in fact, the main point here is that this feeling never disappears. Every time I do qualitative coding for any one project, I go through a variation of this phase depicted in this tweet. But the idea is that you need to be comfortable and patient with the process, that, eventually, as you take in the overwhelming amount of data, your mind is working always to understand the data. Even if you're not looking at an article, your mind is still going to try to understand the data while you're sleeping subconsciously. And eventually, as you're patient with the process, eventually you'll come to a realization, more sense, starting to understand the relationships between these major themes. I'm starting to feel okay and more certain about what's being represented in the list of included articles. And that is the point of, what lots of authors have called it different ways, but that's usually the point of saturation, where, you've looked at the articles enough, and generally things are making sense. So though this process, this experience is guaranteed, that there will be a period of sort of confusion and ambiguity. What is also guaranteed is clarity, as long as you're patient with the process. Okay, now let's talk about coding. So generally, there are two distinct stages of coding: initial and focused. And there are different terms for this as well. So you might, if you read methodological texts, initial coding may be called open coding or descriptive coding, and focus coding may be called, I don't remember what the other word, but one other word is interpretive coding. But generally, initial coding tends to be more on the describing end, that, let me make sense of this data first, what's being said in these articles. Whereas focus coding is the thematic process, is that, okay, now I've looked at I've made a bunch of codes, I know all these concepts that exist in these articles. Now let me try to put them into categories or themes. Let me try to understand what's being said holistically in this data set. That's focus coding. And that's the general difference. So we'll talk about initial coding first. We'll talk about principles and strategies to do initial coding. We'll do an example. I'll walk through a specific example of an excerpt from an interview transcript to show you how I would code. As we had this discussion before we started this, line-by-line coding tends to be the most common way to do initial coding, and literally that does mean by line, though reiterating the point that I mentioned earlier, is that when we're reviewing articles, it's a bit different because articles tend to be in 2 or 3 columns, and therefore each line doesn't necessarily itself represent one idea or one code, but multiple lines or a sentence, an entire paragraph may represent one code or one line. So the point here is that you have to be a little flexible in the types of codes or labels you attribute to a particular section of the manuscript. And line-by-line coding should not be taken literally line by line. It can be taken sentence by sentence. It can take 1.5 sentences if you think the half sentence is part of the previous sentence code. You really have to be guided by your own preconceptions, your understandings of what's happening in that data. Line-by-line coding also tends to be the easiest for coding, but I will talk about a few other strategies to just keep that in your mind in case we choose that route. So there is also word-by-word coding, and that tends to be used in contexts where the word choice is the primary object of analysis. So, for example, in concept analyses, we want to know how a particular word has been utilized by a set of authors, in what context, what that concept, consequences or outcomes follow that concept. So we have to understand each word, how it's used, the order in which it's used, and therefore the word itself becomes the object rather than the line or the sentence or the paragraph. Now, I don't imagine this being relevant for our context because we're really looking at experiences and perspectives, and that tend to be beyond just one word, though just keep your mind that is a strategy that we may need to utilize if we think it is appropriate. I will say that there is one similar variation of word-by-word coding, which is used as commonly as line-by-line codes. It's called in vivo codes. So in vivo, like the laboratory term in vivo, and it literally means that essentially the code that you attribute to a particular section of the manuscript is taken directly from the manuscript. It is the exact words used in that manuscript. And you use this in instances where the word or phrase that's used by a participant or by an author, it's so encompassing of the idea that you see in the data that you word. And these Vivo codes tend to be very powerful because they tend to be very special terms that encompass a huge idea in the end that we represent in the final manuscript. that can basically be used as an anchor for, our analysis, an anchor for a paragraph that really goes into depth about what this actually means, all on that one word or one phrase that a participant or an author used. That tends to be a very effective way to communicate a very complex idea. Vivo to be very but making in vivo codes shouldn't be done all the time. Like, you don't necessarily code every single thing using in vivo codes. You have to really decide for yourself that, oh, is this powerful? Is this amazing? Wow, this made me understand the entire section so much better, right? So you really have to be guided by your own thoughts, your own reactions to what you're seeing, and use that as a way to better to decide whether or not an in vivo code would be useful in the long term in that instance. And finally, one last way that I will discuss to code is incident by incident. And that's essentially used when there is a logical chronology to the particular phenomenon or topic that you're looking at. So, for example, grief, projects I've been doing for the past year and continue to do, there is a logical chronology in the experience of grief, meaning that there is grief that occurs before death, which is anticipatory grief. Then there's grief immediately after or at the time of death. So, grief in the long term, prolonged grief disorder, right? So that logical chronology, one precedes the other. And if that's the case, we may decide that when we're analyzing the data, we decide to split it up based on these three stages. But that chronology really has to reflect the data and really has to offer unique ways to analyze a data set that reveals insights that would not have been revealed otherwise if we use just regular line-by-line coding. And again, for this context, I don't see incident by incident coding useful, but we will remain open to the idea and see where that leads us. Okay, so general principles and guidelines for initial coding. And again, these are principles, but also very general guidelines. The process is really dependent on the individual. You'll have some opportunity and some exercises to practice coding yourself. I'm practicing some of these principles, but when you get in the data, you'll see that some principles may not apply in every single instance, or some principles may have to be varied a little bit to be more applicable and more useful for your for the particular analytical objective. But generally, these are things you need to keep in mind. That broadly, you have to remain open. Right? Initial coding is that stage where you don't judge your ideas too harshly. That you see something, you get an idea that you label as, oh, this is ridiculous, this is crazy idea. You may be right. This is a crazy idea. This is a crazy interpretation. You may be right, but that kind of judgment, we look at those judgments in relationship to other judgments, and we decide whether or not we want to move forward with that judgment. But we can only do that if we are as open and flexible and accommodating as possible in our initial coding, to get as much data as possible, as much description as possible, to allow for those judgments to be further explored at the focus coding level. That's why at this stage you have to be open to your ideas, be open to your ludicrous ideas, your crazy ideas, anything that's coming in your head. But at the same time, don't go into a rabbit hole. You have to stay close to the data. And that's where the line-by-line coding or sentence-by-sentence coding helps, because it anchors you to a particular object of analysis. And by focusing on that objective analysis, you will naturally stay close to that data, though it does not guarantee it. Line-by-line coding does not guarantee staying close to the data. You can always go down a rabbit hole. Now, if that happens, I always recommend that, it's okay, go down the rabbit hole. Record that rabbit hole. And once you have, personal satisfaction and comfort, you like, okay, I want to leave this for myself, record my thoughts and interpret what a memo is, and then move on. Simple as that. record it for a future discussion with your team, and move on. Third sort of principle, general guide, is keep codes simple and precise. You do not want your code longer than what the object of the code, right? If you're coding a sentence, you do not want to use more words than it is in a sentence. You generally, I keep codes to 1 or 2 words, maybe 3 words. Codes, 3 words, and then put a hyphen and add like, this is my thought. You can always do that. But the code itself is the 1 or 2 or 3 words. Whatever comes afterwards is just, your interpretation or your reactions or whatever. If you want to just keep that there as a reminder to explore it in the future, then you can do that as well. But the code itself has to remain simple and precise. Sometimes I find it helpful to look for gerunds because they generally indicate process, and process is at the heart of qualitative research because we want to know, people's experiences and perspectives and preferences, and all of these are captured within a particular process that's happening, not necessarily of an outcome, but the process, preconditions of a particular event or idea or concept or theme, etc. You're also going to compare data with data. And as you do more and more coding, you'll see that comparison will happen more naturally because as you become more familiar with the topic, you will tend to, you will have less control over your mind to I in the fifth goal without referring to the same idea you saw in Article 1. Like that will happen a bit more naturally than the initial phase of reviewing articles. But just do keep in mind that comparison between data and data is a very important process because it helps us to create themes that are more tangible and comprehensible and easier to talk about in the manuscript and in a way that is relevant to whoever our audience is. And in this case, as providers, we want to compare data that allows provider to take this and consider its implications. And that cannot be done by regurgitating 40 articles we have or however many articles we have. We have to take all that data from the 40 articles and condense it into 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. That requires comparison between data and data. The next point is moving quickly through that data and using your spontaneity. And this is another way to stay close to the data. And in some cases, I do find it helpful for 2 reasons. One, I find it helpful because sometimes there's so much data you have to look at that going down every single rabbit hole is just an inefficient use of your time. So you make a conscious effort to tell yourself that, you know what, I'm going to look at this sentence, and the first reaction I'm going to get, I'm going to use that as a code. That's usually, when there's so much data and I don't have a lot of time, that's the approach I take. And generally, the second point is using spontaneity tends to be the better way to, force yourself to stay more which is the approach rather than interpretive. Because if you give your mind more time to think, then you are likely going into the more interpretive dimension because your assumptions and preconditions may become more embedded in what you see. Not to say that they won't sort of inform or influence your spontaneous reaction. Of course they will. But when you have more time to think, they may take different forms. They may not be in the same way as you reacted initially. So therefore, just react and acknowledge that reaction and use that as code. And again, this may not work for everyone, but I mention it as a strategy because I've seen it work quite often for a lot of people, at least in the initial stages. An important point to keep in mind is that one passage, one paragraph can represent many ideas, and therefore you can code 5, 6 things within the same paragraph. So don't be like, this is, I've made one code already, so I'm not going to make any more codes. Put as many paragraph that you think are different enough, right? If they are the same, then you should find a way to put them into one code and one code only. But if you think that these ideas are different enough, then of course you can make them as separate codes. At the same time, one code can capture a line or a whole paragraph. That's really that's really a different way of saying, one passage can represent many ideas, and also going back to, our line by line encoding discussion. Later, once we're on like one of the final set of articles that we're analyzing, we're going to have a list of themes that we think represent the data, and we're going to be continuously refining those themes to better represent the data as we look at and the new in them. At this point, you have to keep in mind that codes that fit into our list of themes are just as important, if not more important, than those codes that fit nicely. Because at the point where we're nearing the end of our initial review of the articles, we want to be as critical as possible to our understanding, because we want to represent the data in the best way that it wants to be represented. We don't want to miss an important point in any way possible, because that in the end, that could be reflected in a peer review comment, that could affect, decision making if, any provider or decision making authority wants to use the article to, make a policy. So one way to be critical is to actively look for codes that don't fit in the themes that we have developed, and try to figure out how to fit those new codes into our themes. And that may require broadening the theme, that may require collapsing a number of themes together into one, or it may require a combination of other strategies. But an important point is that look codes on the line help us to make our analysis more robust. And finally, this is not relevant in a lot of circumstances, and particularly not relevant for us in this either, because it's usually more appropriate for primary studies when you're coding interview transcripts. But you generally don't want to code individuals, because individuals encompass a wealth of experience, and you want to code the differences in their experience rather than as one or three labels. Because if you code the entire individual, in my view, you unfairly categorize them into a very superficial labeling. You don't go into the nuance of their particular experience in the detail that that individual deserves. Simple as that. And again, this is really applies to interview studies. So, but I mention it just as, you know, uh, as a strategy, or as a guideline when you're looking at, for example, quotes, because a lot of the studies that we'll look at will have authors' interpretations and then follow that with a participant quote that they interviewed. And you don't want to code that entire individual as it is. You want to code what they're saying. Okay, so last two things I want to talk about before we end off is focus coding, to illustrate, but I will sum up the things that in the end. And I will show you an example of focus coding, the end result of a focus coding exercise. Essentially, focus coding is really that now we have described this data, we have outlined some of our interpretations. Now, what are the themes that encapsulate the entire data set? Can we distill all of this immense amount of data into a list of what are the concepts, the key codes, the ideas, the sub-themes within each major theme? That's essentially the process. And it's very much trying to, putting certain ideas underneath other ideas in Microsoft Word. Yeah, let me just show you that. Actually, the coding process is very much like, leads to something like this. So a bit of background, this is my raw analysis file for a report I did for a government agency on the sort of the experiences and challenges patients, providers face when delivering opioid use disorder treatment programs. And as you can see, this is Microsoft Word, very simple. There's about 22 pages, 8,330 words. Most of these are my own words. All of these here are my words. This is the major theme. So this is the theme that I've classified as comparing between treatment options and reasons for treatment change. And then the sub-theme is a particular medication. So it's buprenorphine here, and there's methadone later down. So I've the medication is a bunch of references. These references indicate, the article mentioned something related to buprenorphine, and then there's even specific ideas here. So these are specific codes, right? So buprenorphine has a more positive view among drug users than methadone, and as a result, observes greater utilization and retention. That's a code I saw in, 1, 2, 3, 4 articles. And the next one, it's, preference for buprenorphine was made due to negative use of methadone, which was viewed as a drug harmful to the health, 3 articles, but I also included 2 quotes here. So I just made a comment here, quotes, made that, because generally when writing, and I'll show you that next, when it comes to writing the manuscript, the findings section, we want to get those quotes that really emphasize and really take home important points. Because quotes tend to be ideas in a way that causes or that results in the best impact that it can result, especially when the quote is from a participant. And it goes on and on and on and on. And this is the sort of thing that we'll be looking at to do, of developing this bullet points. But I want to mention is focus coding is essentially the process of taking this point and combining it with this point. So moving this bullet point further up if you think it's more appropriate, moving this point to another theme if you think it's more appropriate. That process of going back and forth, moving up and down different ideas, that's what focus coding entails. And we do that until we can agree upon a list of themes and the concept and codes within each theme. And that's the end result of focus coding. Sort of these stages tails. The last stage of focus coding is that once we have these list of themes, once we have all the codes that are within each theme, what we do is we write sort of a narrative summary for each theme. And then one person collects all these narrative summaries, and these are syntheses of all the codes and concepts in a way that is like story-like, it's creative, it's it's analytic. All these summaries are sort of collated into one holistic interpretation of the entire topic. And to really drive home that point, I'm going to open up this document here to show you. So this is the final report for the raw analysis file you just saw. Mm-hmm. Opioid agonist treatments for opioid use disorders, a rapid qualitative review. All this stuff is just like background, introduction, methods. I'm going to go, right here. So these are where the findings start. So this is a major theme. Let me just orient you to the research question first, so you can have sort of an anchor when thinking about right here. So there's 3 research questions. Let's just focus on the 2 because we're the most relevant. So how do people with opioid use disorders and their healthcare providers understand, communicate, and make decisions related to opioid agonist treatments? How have people with opioid use disorders experienced treatment with opioid agonists? What are the perspectives on and preferences for programs that offer opioid agonist treatments? Now going back. So the first theme that I chose to identify in the patient section, so there's a separate healthcare provider section that we won't go into, but the first theme was about seeking treatment. So what are the challenges or experiences or preferences that patients have when they decide that they want to seek treatment? And this was actually in contrast to another theme that comes later down, which is about continuing treatment. So that is basically pertaining to that when patients are in treatment, they're enrolled in a treatment program, what are the challenges they face to remain within that program? For the purposes of this one example, I'll just talk about seeking treatment. And then, so this is the major theme, and I describe the major theme in general. I'll provide what is called a signpost paragraph, which is orients to the specific ideas within the major motivations, so the challenges associated with the individual themselves. The other sub-theme right here, which comes later on, is the external circumstances. So the challenges the individual face outside of them. But this is what is the result of focus coding, writing a narrative summary, and collating the narrative summary. And I'll read this out to you, and I'll highlight specific things that were in that came up in the coding process, so you see what's the outcome of it. So descriptions of the onset of treatment seeking behavior were accompanied by expressions of motivation, avoidance, and behavior change. Treatment seeking behavior was often characterized by treatment readiness, in quotations, a bunch of citations, which patients in 3 studies expressed as tired of being tired. Stopping here for a moment. Treatment readiness, tired of being tired. These were in vivo codes that I made when I first looked at, I think, 1 or 2 articles where I mentioned it. And I thought that, this was so encompassing of the entire idea that I didn't even want to get into it. I just want to say patients are saying relevance and a lot of interesting, unique implications for this particular sub-theme. Okay, and just continuing, I'll just finish off this paragraph. This expression indicates that some patients experience an internal motivation for behavior change that accompanied self-confidence, hope, and commitment to change. This renewed motivation often accompanied engagement in case management, group counseling, being patient with treatment, and giving new treatment a chance. For other patients, this motivation was described as being due to a desire to avoid. Now, looking at this entire thing, there's so many different ideas that are happening, so many articles as well from which like you see all these numbers here. These are all different articles, so a lot of back and forth has happened between different articles. But as you can see, that this reads really nicely. It reads like a story, it has a chronology, it reads smoothly, and that's the sort of outcome of the focus coding. Any sort of qualitative review you'll read, well, not any, because a lot of qualitative reviews are done superficially. Qualitative reviews that go into the interpreted dimensions represent the data in this way, and they may even go beyond this, which is a conversation for a different time. But if you want to go to the interpretation, you have to represent the data in some way like this. You can't say, oh, study said this, 3 studies said this, 5 studies said this, 6 studies said this, etc. No. See, things are flowing between ideas. The ideas are connected somehow.